Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's CXPA webinar, which is being presented by Confirmit, a CXPA Gold Global sponsor. Today's webinar is going to provide you with a series of learning opportunities. We encourage you to listen, turn off your email, mute your phone, and jot down the key takeaways. You can submit questions via the questions box in your dashboard, and at the end of the presentation, we will open up for a Q&A. If you're tweeting today, please use hashtag CXPAwebinar. And most importantly, soak in the presentation and take what you've learned today and transfer it to your business. I'd like to welcome Jana Sedivy, founder and principal of Authentic Insight, and Sarah Simon, director, Voice of the Customer Consulting of Confirmit. Thank you both for sharing your knowledge with us today. And now I'll turn the reins over to Sarah.
Thank you very much. Today's webinar is hosted by Confirmit, the leading provider of solutions for Voice of the Customer, Voice of the Employee, and market research. Confirmit provides software and services around the globe to help you gather insights needed to increase customer retention, improve employee engagement, and sharpen your competitive edge in the market. Welcome to our session, Demystifying B2B Customer Journey Mapping. I'm Sarah Simon, your host today. I'm a 20-year veteran of customer and business intelligence. I've spent a lot of energy and passion helping B2B customer experience practitioners like yourselves to build dynamic voice of the customer listening programs and hone their customer experience strategy and execution. I'm currently VOC Consulting Director at Confirmit, and in this role I help companies like yours decide when, where, and how to listen to customers and how to act on insights that your customers, employees, and partners share with you. Jana and I are both active on social media and would love to see you sharing your thoughts about this webinar in Twitter. So in addition to that hashtag shared earlier, if you could also use the hashtag B2BCJM for business to business customer journey mapping so we can interact with you on Twitter following this session. Before introducing our key presenter today, Jana Sedivy, I want to provide a brief introduction to our topic and why we're here today. If you ask anyone in B2B sales, marketing, or services, they'll tell you that working in business to business is simply different than working in the business to consumer world. In the VOC and customer experience space, despite a common core of best practices, we inherently know a different set of rules applies when structuring B2B client listening programs and customer experience improvement efforts. Customer journey mapping in particular can be somewhat overwhelming for the B2B practitioner. Multiple touch points, a frequency of contacts throughout several organizations, dispersed purchase decision-making, the partner landscape, and multi-year contracts all can render mapping the B2B customer journey a scary exercise. So what exactly is it that makes the B2B relationship so special and the B2B customer journey process intimidating? Well, I boil this down to three primary points. It's the complexity of the relationship, the longevity of the relationship, and the motivations behind doing business together. So first, let's explore the complexity of a B2B relationship. A B2B relationship can include multiple touch points in a single year, month, week, day, or hour. At any given moment in a B2B relationship, several interactions can be taking place. Let's consider a few of these examples that you may see in your day-to-day business world. Okay, a technician calls your tech support desk. At the same time, one of your program managers is meeting with a vendor account manager. While that's going on, a sales director is on site with a potential client to make a pitch for a new solution. Meanwhile, a product leaves your warehouse bound for a client office. And as all this is going on, one of your client executives is reading a recent blog post. So you can see there's a lot going on, often simultaneously at various levels throughout a B2B relationship that makes that journey very complex. So what about the longevity? Consider that I can go to a restaurant once in my lifetime and never return, where by contrast, B2B relationships can be formalized into multi-year contracts. Even the sales cycle for B2B products and services tends to be protracted. So again, let's consider a few examples of the longevity of these B2B relationships. So a technician calls to the tech support desk, and that call may only last 20 minutes, but that same technician may call the tech support number several times throughout the year. That sales director who was on site, well, he might only be on site for an hour meeting to pitch a solution, but all these conflicting stakeholder opinions and various senses of urgency stretch the decision out for 6 months. And it takes a client perhaps just a minute to use your online ordering system to purchase components, and these components can ship the same day. But those components are an integral part of a product design that took 18 months to engineer. So basically, business-to-business customer experience cannot be reduced to a series of quick interactions. The success of B2B vendors rests on nurturing long-term relationships with clients and partners. And lastly, let's take a look at this concept of varying motivations between B2B and B2C. Okay, if you go in to buy a car, you go to that car lot, you're using your own cash to make that purchase. Now, you may have to consider a spouse or other members of your family when it comes to that purchase impacting them, but that's a lot different than, say, having to worry about your company's board and how they're going to feel about this purchase. So going out and buying even a major consumer purchase like a new car or truck is quite a different experience than a professional entering a multi-year contract on behalf of his company. B2B motivations are colored by a host of characters, including initiators, third-party influencers, gatekeepers, and end users. So if you would take a look at these categories that I have up here on the screen, you may recognize where your company is in terms of your customer experience practice. Or you may look and say, hey, you know, I think I actually span a couple of these categories. So we're going to trigger a poll now. We'd like for you to participate and kind of self-assess which of these categories, which of the following categories do you best fit into? Are you more of a beginner with your customer experience? This could be you don't even have a whole lot of customer listening. Your voice of customer effort kind of sits out on the fringes of your organization. You're pretty much exploratory in this process. And when it comes to customer journey mapping, the CX beginner is often thinking, customer journey mapping, are you kidding me? I'm still trying to get my surveys settled. I'm still trying to listen to the voice of the customer. Then we have our intermediates, and I'm sure quite a few of you may fall into this category. You maybe have developed a pretty robust voice of customer listening program, but right now you're still pretty limited on the action that's coming out of those insights gathered. And voice of customer might be a limited function or an established function, but you're still very informative. You're sharing reports with your colleagues, you're sharing reports with business units, but you're not necessarily really a change agent at this point. And when it comes to customer journey mapping, you might kind of know enough about it to be dangerous. And at this point, you're not really sure where customer journey fits in with your overall voice of customer and customer experience initiative and strategy. And then finally, we probably have a few experts out there. These individuals are not only listening to the voice of customer, but using customer experience to drive change management. Customer experience is baked into your organization, and you're not only sharing informative reports with people, but you're actually holding business units accountable for driving change in the organization. In some cases, maybe you've already done customer journey mapping, but it could have been 2 to 3 years ago. So thank you to those of you who took part in the poll. That was definitely very helpful. It seems like we have the vast majority of us in the intermediate and the beginner area, but we do have quite a few experts on the phone as well, so thank you. What I want to leave you with is this. Regardless of where you are in that customer experience effort, you could benefit from customer journey mapping. So it can be a great way to structure your VOC listening program in the first place. Or maybe you're still trying to build out that voice of customer program. Using journey mapping, you know that you can select the right listening posts, set up your VOC architecture, prioritize those listening posts, and make sure that you're using the right listening channels. Maybe you're there in the middle in that intermediate world with your customer experience efforts, and I can tell you that customer journey mapping is a great way to help you tell the customer's story from the customer's perspective, right? To go from just throwing up charts and graphs to actually telling a business story about the way that your customer succeeds and sometimes does not succeed in doing business with your company. And finally, if you're one of those experts who says, we've already done customer journey mapping, we've crossed that off the list, I want to remind you that your client life cycle is impacted by all of that merger and acquisition, your staffing changes, vendor and competitive landscape changes, and it's a good opportunity for you to revisit B2B customer journey mapping. So journey mapping can be intimidating, especially for the B2B practitioner, and that's why we have a special guest here today with us to help demystify customer journey mapping, particularly in the B2B arena. Jana Sedivy is founder and principal of Authentic Insight. She specializes in voice of customer research and strategy for B2B tech companies. She's a recognized expert in customer experience research. Over the past 20 years, Jana has lived at this intersection of people and technology, and I like to describe Jana as a bit of an engineer whisperer, right? Kind of like the horse whisperer or the dog whisperer. Jana helps B2B customer experience practitioners bring the voice of the customer into product design and service optimization discussions, yes, even at technology companies. Her specialty at Authentic Insight is bringing voice of the customer vividly into the discussion of these B2B corporations. So Jana, I'm about to turn things over to you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to, if you can just leave that slide up for a second. So I just wanted to talk a bit about the companies I worked with. So some of these companies make some really cool products, like Adobe makes Photoshop and nifty things like that, but I never work on the cool products. I work on the Adobe Forms Enterprise Management System, which you've probably never heard of, but if you've ever filled in an IRS form, you would have interacted with that technology. So please don't hate me already for that. And Bentley, that's not the luxury car manufacturer. That's actually an AutoCAD type of software that's used by civil engineers designing airports and shopping malls. So this is the kind of world that I live in and that I love to live in. I love to work with complex products that are in specialized niches that are used by really smart people. So that's what I like to do. And so I'm going to tell you how I do it. Okay, now I'm ready to show my slides.
Okay, there you are.
All right. Oh, okay. So I'm going to talk today about customer journeys for B2B, and I'm really grateful that all of you guys have come in. There's a lot of people on this webinar, and you could be doing a lot more fun things like standing in line for the new Star Wars movie. So I'm really glad that you guys are here with me, and I hope to make it worth your while. Okay, so I think most of you are already familiar with the general idea, but for those of you that are new to it, the concept of a customer journey is really simple. It's all the steps that a customer takes when interacting with your company. So it starts when they first start thinking about finding a solution to a problem. And in the ideal world that we all hope to achieve, it never really ends, but has them engaged in a relationship of ongoing usage, repurchasing, and of course recommending us to other prospects. So as Sarah talked about in the introduction, the world that you guys deal with is really different from the consumer world. So in the consumer space, the buyer and user are the same person, but in B2B, that's rarely the case. Often in B2C, there's only one stakeholder, but in B2B, there's lots of different stakeholders, and not just the buyer and user being different, but there's other people who influence the decision and that are going to be affected by the decision down the road. And in the consumer world, sales cycles are short, but in B2B, the sales cycles are, you know, in consumer space, it's like, I need it, I want it, I go to the website, boom, I'm done. But in B2B, it's completely different. You might have a manager or a director who identifies a problem, then they have to build a business case, they present it to their boss, they get approval, then they go through procurement. It can take a really long time. Sometimes it takes 18 to 24 months. And it's also very high touch in general. So your account team will meet with multiple people and really try to get to know the individual and the politics of the organization. And if somebody leaves the organization, then that can affect the entire deal that you've been working on for 12 months. So it's very involved, right? And there's a lot more touch points in B2B as well. So by the time the deal is done and the product is being used, your customer or some pieces of your customer have interacted with pretty much all the departments in your company in one form or another. So here's an example of some of the different rules that you need to consider. So let's say, for example, you're making a inventory management system. So your buyer, the one who's making the decision to write the check, is probably someone like the CFO, and they're worried about cutting costs, streamlining their processes. They want to have a dashboard that shows them how they're doing on their key performance indicators. But they're going to be really heavily influenced by the head of IT, and they're going to tell them about whether or not it integrates into their existing infrastructure, whether or not it's secure, if it's okay to use cloud-based storage, blah, blah, blah. Then you have your users, and your user might be somebody in the warehouse who's working with the radio blaring all day and forklifts driving around him. And then you might have another user who's the warehouse inventory manager, and she's sitting in a cubicle in some branch office in a totally different city. So you need to think about all these people, and they all have different touch points that they interact with. So let's talk about touch points. So in B2B, so you have a lot of different touch points, and these are all the ways that customers interact with your company. So before they've even bought your product, they've interacted with your website, they might have downloaded some content, they might be on your mailing list, they've talked to their colleagues in their community, they've met a sales rep, maybe brought in a sales engineer to talk to their IT team about it. And then, of course, after they've made the purchasing decision, there's still a whole bunch of other touch points. So there's accounts payable, the installation team, training and education, using the product, and customer support. And that's where the ConfirmIt tools come in really handy, because it can help you gather data at all these different touch points to develop your voice of customer picture. But there's actually something that's, in a way, it's more important than these touch points, because it happens before the journey even starts. The customer journey really starts when people experience a problem, because people buy products because they have a problem and they think that investing in a product is going to fix it. So it's really important that you understand what is the problem that's the trigger for your customer, because that determines whether or not they even start down the journey of touch points at all, if you don't understand their problem properly. So in B2B, there are 4 kind of broad categories of phases. So first off, they're experiencing a problem. Then the next thing they do is they start looking for a solution. Then once they make the purchase decision, there's usually a fairly involved onboarding phase. And then there's ongoing usage, which can hopefully last years. So let's talk about a bit more detail about all the different touch points in each of these phases. So the first one is professional community. So this is kind of a weird one, because in a way it's not a touch point because they're not interacting with your company yet, but it's really critical. So when you're dealing with complex, expensive systems in a specialized industry, what's the first thing that your prospects are going to do? The first thing they do is they ask the people in their industry, how did you solve the problem? Who did you use? And are they any good? And that determines whether or not they go to any of your other touch points, like your website and anything else. So in a lot of ways, this is more important than stuff like search engine optimization, which you hear a lot about, because you need to think about how your company is part of that community, and you need to think about what your customers are saying about you right now. Are they saying good things, or are they saying bad things? Another misunderstood touch point in B2B is your social media presence. So that doesn't necessarily mean, are you on Twitter or are you on Pinterest? Your customers might not be interacting there so much for their professional interests, but you need to understand a lot of the times their influencers hang out in interesting places. So for example, one of my clients sold a very technical security product, which is basically an authentication server. And the main influencers for their customers were the developers in the IT team on the on the customer side. And those guys spent a lot of time on this website called Stack Overflow. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's basically a question and answer portal where developers ask questions about pretty much like any technology, any programming language, everything, right? Ranging from Java to Excel to authentication servers. And this particular vendor had developers that were very involved in that community, and that gave them a tremendous amount of credibility, because then the influencers at their customers would know they're making real meaningful contributions to the community, and that means that their website isn't just full of marketing blah blah. These guys are the real deal. So understanding the watering holes, so to speak, where your buyers and their influencers congregate is really critical. Then of course there's your website. Make sure it looks good on mobile, and you might have some downloadable collateral that people can look at. You probably also have demos that you've developed or product tours. Another important touch points is sales reps and the sales engineers. And then there's also often an RFP step, and I just want to talk a little bit about that because it's actually a very important touch point. It not only helps you make the sale, but you have to realize that if you're only reacting once they've put out an RFP, you're probably not in a really strong position. You need to really understand what's motivating the RFP. So many, many years ago, I used to work at a research lab where there were a lot of projects that were funded by DARPA, which is the Department of Defense in the United States. And it was well known with all the researchers that the real way to win an RFP was to get really friendly with the DARPA leads and convince them that what they needed was an RFP that was exactly aligned with your research project. So that's the ideal situation you want to try to get into if you can help when your customer is just starting to think about the problem. If you can help them articulate it, that means getting involved really, really early in their customer journey when they're just at the starting point. Then there's the onboarding phase, and a lot of B2B sales have to go through a painful procurement process, and you can't necessarily do anything about it, but you need to be aware that a lot of the time buying your product is a hassle for your customer, and they just want to go back to their regular job. So even though it's not really in your control, you just need to realize that they're already facing considerable internal barriers most likely, so just make sure that you're not putting any additional ones in their way. So what is your accounts payable department like to deal with? Are they making your customer's job easier or harder? And do you have an account rep that can help them kind of shepherd them through that process? And then there's receiving the product. This is an important step that is often overlooked in a B2B environment, but it's kind of a wasted opportunity a lot of the time for making a good first impression, because now your customer has just spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money on your product. And when they first see your product in action, does it make them feel good about that decision, or are they going to start to question it from day one? So, for example, one of my clients is a company that manufactures precision scientific instruments which cost more than a car. And they just recently did a customer journey mapping exercise and discovered that, maybe they should take a moment to print out some nice looking labels instead of handwriting them on the box with a marker, because sloppy handwritten labels don't exactly convey the message, this product is ultra high tech and super precise, which it is, but it conveys exactly the opposite message when they can't even read the handwriting on the box. Then, of course, you might have, your customer might need help with installation, you might have an integration engineer, and you also need to think about whether or not they need any education or training and what that's like. Then there's the ongoing usage phase. So this is where we get back to the original problem that your customer had. So they were looking for a solution to a problem, and they bought your product because they thought they would fix it. So the most important thing here is, does it deliver the value that it promised? And are both the users and the buyers getting the benefits? So the important touch points here are the product itself, how well does it work? And this is where you have to really think about not just the buyers. So up until this point, you've been really thinking a lot about the buyers and the influencers. Once you get into the ongoing usage, you have to think about the users, which is a totally different set of people. And then there's technical support, and that's a really interesting one, because the tech support is often your lowest paid employees in your company, but they're also one of the most customer facing, and they're also dealing with customers who've already spent a bunch of time getting annoyed and trying to fix a problem, and now finally they're calling tech support. So you need to really think about how well you're delivering on that. And again, that's where the confirmant tools come in really handy, because you can really start to develop an understanding of what the voice of the customer is at that point. Okay, so I've been talking at a fairly detailed level about all these different touch points, but I just want to back up a few levels. So one of the reasons that I love to use customer journeys as a tool is because they're incredibly effective as a framework for communicating to stakeholders. So very simply, customer journeys work because they're stories, right? Human beings are just hardwired to like stories. It goes back to our caveman brain, especially when you're dealing with high-level decision makers. Not to say that high-level decision makers are like cavemen, but they're just really, really busy. So you need to make it very easy for them to get the point, and nothing works as well as a story for that. So when I started in this business as a customer researcher, I thought, oh yeah, the data is just going to speak for itself, and I would prepare really detailed graphs and show lots of statistics. And this is the reaction that I would get. Like, eyes would glaze over, and just as people were getting lulled into a nice little snooze, a sales rep would pipe up with a story from the field. And it would be just about one customer, and it might have contradicted my data, but it would be a very compelling story. And that's what would stick. People wouldn't remember my graphs that I had so diligently prepared. They would remember that story. And at first, it made me really mad, but then I realized that I could really learn something from these guys about how to communicate. And so I was really excited to start learning about customer journey maps, because it's such an effective way to communicate. So I want to help you guys get started with this. So here's what I want you to do today. So grab a pen, grab a piece of paper, carve out about 30 to 60 minutes of uninterrupted time, and think about those 4 phases for your business. What's the problem? How are they finding a solution? What's the onboarding like? And what's your ongoing usage like? And what does that look like for you? And what are the different touch points for each of those stages? And then once you've got that mapped out, you can call a meeting. Collect a representative from each touch point and get them all in a single room. You could have, if you're all lucky enough to be in the same city, it's awesome. You can be in the same room, and you can use sticky notes up on a wall. That works great. If you're all in different cities, I like to use something called stormboard.com. It actually does a pretty good job of simulating the whole sticky note thing, and it's very reasonably priced as well. So when you start having this conversation, just pick a single customer journey. Just pick like one case study that you happen to be aware of, and just talk through all the different steps. But you do have to be a bit careful here in this kind of meeting, because it can very easily devolve into finger pointing and what I like to call the blame thrower. So you need to be really careful that you make it a safe environment so that people can accept responsibility for some shortcomings, but not have them be the scapegoat of the conversation. And so it can be helpful if you have a very divisive or contentious environment where the different departments do not get along. It can be very helpful to have a facilitator come in and help out with that. Then what you can do is draw a picture. You can start to map out the journey. So at each step, think about, okay, what are they doing? What are they thinking and feeling? What departments of your company are they interacting with? And what is that interaction like? And who are their influencers at each step? And then also really think about where people are happy or upset or stressed out, whether it's your fault or otherwise, because it's really important to understand the emotional state. So here's an example. So if you Google customer journey maps, you can find a whole bunch of different types of models that people use, but this is the template that I really like to use, especially for B2B. So we talked about the 4 phases, which we've got across the top. You have a problem, looking for a solution, onboarding, and ongoing usage. And down the left, you've got how they're feeling, ranging from very positive to very negative. So here's an example of a customer that needs to buy a CRM system. So their situation is they're growing and they're starting to get a little bit out of hand with all these different spreadsheets, and different salespeople have different information in their heads. So they're thinking they need to have a more streamlined customer relationship management process. So again, the first thing they do is they talk to their colleagues and peers. What did you use to solve this problem? Then they ask the vendors to bid on an evaluation process. Then they start knocking vendors off the list based on price, the website, the stuff they've gotten downloaded from their website, input from peers. And then they're going to meet with, they meet with the sales rep. And they like the sales rep and they feel like this person has a really good understanding of their problem. So they'll take it to the next step, which is a meeting with the sales engineer of the vendor and their internal IT team to determine whether they can make the integration work and talk about some of the details. And then they make the decision to purchase. So they're feeling really good about that. But then they fall into the pit of despair, which is the procurement process. And then after all that, they finally get the product, but installation is a nightmare, and it takes 4 weeks to just install the product. So an account rep has to fly in to help resolve the issues and provide some training. And so then the system's up and being used, and there's some hiccups along the way, but mostly a lot of the users are complaining that they can't figure out how to use the system, and it's sucking up a lot of their time and making them inefficient. And then when they call tech support is not very responsive and not super competent either, because it's been outsourced somewhere. So when you look at this map, what's kind of interesting is if you look at the emotional state, right? The pre-sales emotional state is generally higher than the post-sales. This is not a good situation, because what's going to happen when somebody asks them, hey, who did you use for this problem and are they any good? They're probably not going to give rave reviews, right? So what you can do when you start looking at this map is say, okay, where are my low points and what can we do to boost that? So in this example, the installation was really, really painful. So the vendor put a lot of effort into getting that installation time, get it from 4 weeks down to 2 weeks, down to 1 week, down to a day. They put a huge amount of effort into that. And also technical support, but that was a whole other can of worms there. Then once you've mapped out the journey using just one case study, you can go out and collect some more data. You can interview some of your customers. And surprisingly, you don't actually need to talk to a lot of customers to get really useful data. So my general rule of thumb for these things is you stop doing interviews once you stop being surprised by what you hear. And your mileage kind of varies on that, but the number usually turns out to be somewhere between 6 and 10 people. Because believe me, if you have a real problem with your tech support, you don't need to talk to 100 people to find that out. You're going to hear that over and over again when you talk to 6 people. And again, you're just trying to find the low-hanging fruit at this point. And when you're doing the interviews, it's mostly just a series of questions of, and then what happened? And then what did you do? And who were you talking to at this point? And what were you thinking at this point? Were you pissed off at this point? But one of the things that might happen in these interviews is you might find that the customer is a little bit cagey about giving you really candid feedback. And again, this is because of the really super intertwined relationship that customers have with their vendors in the B2B world. So I find a useful workaround for that is to say, well, what do other people say about us? So that gives them a little bit of an out, because then they can say, well, we think you're great, but what I've been hearing other people say is blah, 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 blah. So that can be a very useful way to find out what are people saying in the community. Then once you've done a bunch of interviews, what you do is you put all your stories together. So there are going to be some really common themes. So again, if you've got a problem with your tech support, that's going to come out loud and clear, and you can combine all your stories into kind of a canonical customer story that you can present to the stakeholders. And an aggregate journey is great because it's evidence-based, because it's built up from your interviews, but it still allows you to describe your data in the form of a story. And then once you've got that, you can identify what are the lowest points of your journey and what are the things that are actually in your control to start changing. And what are maybe one or two things that will give you the biggest win? Because again, not in a consumer world, a lot of the times, because they have a lot of customers, they're often trying to just get like a 5–10% improvement in certain areas. But in B2B, you tend to have fewer customers but much bigger deals. So if you can just improve one or two things, it can have a very dramatic difference in the relationship you have with your customers. Okay, I want to spend a moment to talk about our friends, the engineers, because what I hear from a lot of people that work on the customer research or marketing side of the organization is they want to get the engineering team to buy into this research that they're doing about their customers and just listen to them when they tell them this is what the customers are saying. So I'd like to suggest a little bit of a mindset shift. So you're not trying to get people to buy into your project. You're trying to build up an understanding of the customer. And it's a subtle mindset shift, but it's important. And it does take more work on your part to do this, but in the end, you are going to be more successful. So the thing that you need to understand about engineers is that they are craftsmen and women, and they love to make beautiful things, and they want to make good products. But the part that they're missing is that they don't understand the customers, and sometimes they know they don't understand it, and sometimes they don't know that they don't understand them. So your mission is to help them build up that understanding. So here's what I've found to be really effective for getting engineers on your side. So the main thing is you want to get them really involved. So what you do is when you're planning interviews or planning a research project, you send out your question lists and request feedback. And you have to send it out with a message like, speak now or forever hold your peace, because engineers will love to poke holes in your methodology, and the last thing you want to have happen is have them hijack the meeting when you're presenting the results and start criticizing your methodology. If you're going to have that argument, you need to have it before you even get started. So give them an opportunity to have that discussion early on. And it's going to be painful. It can often be painful, but it's really worthwhile doing it first. Then, whenever you do an interview, invite all the stakeholders to every customer interview, and I mean every customer interview, and all the stakeholders, so the engineers, the product managers, the marketing managers, the salespeople, the account reps, everybody. But when you invite them to the interview, make sure you put them in listen-only mode, or if you have time, brief them on the proper way to talk to customers, because I've actually had engineers say stuff, when the customer is talking, the engineer will burst in and say, oh, that's exactly what I've been trying to tell the product manager for years, but they never listen to me, so I'm really glad you're saying that. This is a really bad thing to have happen, and you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And then after every interview, send out a short summary to all the stakeholders that you invited. And I mean very short, like something that they can scan in like 30 seconds. So what you're doing here is you're actually kind of deluging people with emails about and calendar invites about all this stuff you're doing. And there's actually a method to that madness. But you're going to find that there's kind of good news and bad news, right? So most of them will not come to your interviews. What usually happens is I might have 15, 20 people to invite to a customer interview. I might get 1 or 2 people come to the first 3, and then nobody comes after that. But that's actually okay. Then they might not be reading your summaries, or if they do, they very quickly read them. And most of the time, they're not going to respond to any of this. But here's kind of the weird thing. All this work that you're doing, so it feels like you're just sending this stuff into a black hole, and it can be very discouraging. But in the end, they will listen to your results more. So the way I like to think about it is, think of it kind of like political ads, right? So the people designing political ads, they know that you're not listening to them very closely. All they're trying to do is throw bite-sized pieces of information at you over and over again so that you're left with this kind of general impression of the candidates. So that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to create this peripheral awareness, like, hey, I'm out here talking to customers. Hey, I'm talking to customers. Hey, I'm talking to customers. Want to come? Hey, I'm talking to customers. Here's what they said. Here's what they said. Here's what they said. And that peripheral awareness, first of all, helps to remind them that you're out there, that you're not just making this stuff up. Because the alternative is you disappear for 3 weeks while you're doing this project and then come in with a report, and then they don't really know where it came from. So if you've been doing all this work up front to sort of keep them notified of all the stuff you're doing, that helps for them to buy into your results. And then the other thing is, if they have been reading your summaries, when they come in to the results meeting, a lot of this stuff is going to start sounding a little bit familiar to them, and people will just generally gravitate towards something that sounds familiar. So this is just an organizational hack that I use that takes advantage of some just weird brain stuff and behavioral economic stuff, and I just find it really super. Actually, even I just assumed that it was going straight into their trash folder, but I kept sending them anyway. And then literally about 5 years later, I ran into one of them, and she said, oh yeah, I remember those interview summaries you sent out about insurance agents. They were amazing. And she even remembered a detailed story from one of the interviews. So again, that speaks to the power of stories, because this wasn't like a really exciting story. I mean, it was an insurance agent, for God's sake. Like, how fascinating can that be? But because it was in the form of a story, it was something that really stuck with her even 5 years later. Okay, so I can go on about this for ages, but I'm going to just stop here. And I created some freebies for you all to get started. If you go to AuthenticInsight.com/CXPA, you will find a toolkit which holds some customer journey templates, a worksheet. I've also included some email templates for inviting engineers to meetings and inviting participants to interviews, and also in an interview summary format that you're free to use. So I would love it if you use this stuff, modified it for your own situation. If you found it useful, send me an email, let me know. That would make me really happy. And just generally, I love to geek out about this stuff, so if you ever want to give me a call and just bounce some ideas off me for 10 minutes, that's actually my idea of a good time, so feel free to reach out. So thanks very much for your time, everyone, and I think we'll open it up to questions.
Absolutely, Jana, thank you. Sarah's back here, and we do have several audience questions that I would like to pose to you. We had a couple questions regarding customer involvement in the customer journey mapping process. Essentially, what are some ways to include the customer in the journey mapping process?
Yes, so I'm not sure, so do you mean like customer interviews, like how to do the interviews, or I'm not sure I completely understand or how to reach out to them?
Sure. Basically, a few folks in the audience are just, they're wondering about ways that they can kind of include the voice of the customer more directly in the customer journey mapping process, even perhaps involving the customers in some of the sessions, for instance. Or are there some major warnings that you have against that you would like to share?
Yeah, so the most important thing is to just talk to customers as much as possible. And sometimes in B2B environments, it can actually be pretty difficult because there's often lots of different levels of bureaucracy between you and the customer. So what I like to do is try to have a long-term strategy and a short-term strategy. So in the long term, you have to make friends with the salespeople and the account managers. So get to know them, make friends with them. Every time they close a deal, send them an email and say, hey, congratulations, that's awesome. And that way, they're like a really good entrance point into talking to customers. Then also make friends with the tech support people. So people who are, so anyone in your organization that's actually talking to customers, get to know them and help them set up their voice of customer program with those touch points. And then in the short term, sometimes when you want to talk to customers, because it can be so difficult to work your way through all the different levels of bureaucracy, it can be sometimes more effective to just try to recruit people, bypass that whole thing, and just recruit people externally through a marketing recruiting agency based on some screening criteria. Does that help?
All right. It does. Thank you. Thank you. Another question from the audience. What are some tips or ways to gauge the emotional state of customers throughout the customer journey?
Yeah, so there's a few ways you can do that. One of the things you can do is often at various touch points you can have very quick surveys. So for example, when you do a Skype call, right, it asks you how good was the audio and the video for this, and it just takes 30 seconds for someone to respond, but it gives you a pretty good sense of, you know, how happy or annoyed they are with it. When they click excellent, that means they're happy. If they clicked 1 star, it means they're not happy. So you can collect data like that at these different touch points, and that's where, you know, your tools come in really handy. And then when you're just, if you're doing an interview, you can ask them, because people will often just be pretty upfront about that, like, oh yeah, this was really painful, and this part was really great.
Speaking of tools, Jana, we have a question out there. If there are customer journey mapping tools that you can recommend. I believe they're speaking about technology tools specifically.
Well, you know, I actually find that keeping it low tech is pretty good. So there are some tools out there, but I haven't found one that I've found to be just I find that just paper and drawings and drawing out a picture, even in just PowerPoint slides, that works great. So I think this is something that you actually don't have to get super high tech about.
Okay.
But I would love
earlier.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, finish, please.
Well, I was going to say, if anybody does have some favorite tools, I'd love to hear about it. So if you put that into the chat box, I'd love to hear about some tools, because this is a very it's a rapidly evolving and growing area, so there's new stuff coming out all the time. So I'd love to keep up to date. So if somebody's got some tools that they've used, I'd love to hear about it.
All right. Fairly early in your presentation, we've received this question. Do we create separate journey maps for each stakeholder or integrate these into one journey map?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So kind of both. So it does help to think about specifically each stakeholder. But the issue is that sometimes there's some stakeholders that are involved before, and then some stakeholders that are involved after. So it does help to integrate integrate all of them together. So ideally, what you want to do is have kind of an overall picture of the customer as a whole, what the organization's experience is like, and then also break it down into individual stakeholder journeys.
Right, and I think kind of last one, best one, Jana. I'm seeing several questions come across. I'm trying to kind of boil them down into a theme here. Several of the audience members have written that, yeah, B2B journeys, customer journeys are complex. We think ours is even more complex than what you've talked about here. We have multiple business units. We have iterative processes, different client types, client needs, different lines of business. So I guess maybe what some of the audience is looking for some input on is similar to the question of, do we map one stakeholder journey or integrate them into one? What if our business is so complex? Does it make sense to maybe have, is it possible to boil multiple business units into one customer journey map, or should we try to kind of, carve the steak and maybe do separate business unit journey maps, for example? Do you have any advice there on how to kind of approach that?
Well, so sometimes you can get a little bit lost in the weeds. Like, yeah, there's a lot of differences, but probably the stuff that's going to give you the biggest win probably cuts across all of your organizations, right, and all the different business units. So there might be differences, but those maybe are not the important ones that you should be focusing on. So make sure you don't lose sight of the forest for the trees, right? So again, for example, if you have a problem with tech support, it kind of doesn't really matter what business unit you're dealing with. This is going to be a problem across the board. So just be aware of that. I mean, I think it's good just as a thought experiment to map out those journeys, not necessarily make it a big project, but just set aside some time to think about it and think about where are some of the things that you might drill into. So, for example, a lot of B2B businesses might have, they'll sell directly to a customer, but then they'll also have channel partners, and then the whole channel partner thing is going to be a whole other journey. So, you might want to sit down and think about what the differences are, but I think most of the time you'll actually find that there's more similarities than there are differences. And that's what you want to focus on, because that's actually going to be where you'll get the biggest benefit when you start changing it.
All right, Jana, thank you. Before I turn things back over to the CXPA team to wrap things up, several of the audience members have noted that when they go to the authenticinsight.com/CXPA, I believe it's /CXPA, that they're getting a page not displayed. For the audience, when I included the www dot, I was able to view the page just fine. So we can certainly offline try to resolve any other issues. But before that, I'd like to encourage any of those of you who try to go and download Jana's toolkit that you try putting the www dot in front of that URL provided, and you may have better luck. So with that, I am going to turn things back over to the CXPA team. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining the presentation. Thank you, Jana and Sarah, for being here today and for your wonderful and educational presentation. Please check out cxpa.org for more information about the CXPA, and be sure to mark your calendar for the CXPA's upcoming Insight Exchanges, March 31st in London and May 3rd and 4th in Atlanta. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.